The Scramble for Africa was the invasion, occupation, division, colonization and annexation of African territory by European powers during the period of new imperialism, between 1881 and 1914. It is also called the Partition of Africa and the Conquest of Africa. In 1870, only 10% of Africa was under European control. By 1914 it had increased to 90% of the continent, with only Ethiopia, the Dervish state and Liberia still being independent. The Berlin Conference of 1884, which regulated European colonization and trade in Africa, is usually referred to as the starting point of the Scramble for Africa. Consequent to the political and economic rivalries among the European empires in the last quarter of the 19th century, the partitioning of Africa was how the Europeans avoided warring amongst themselves over Africa. The latter years of the 19th century saw the transition from informal imperialism by military influence and economic dominance to the direct rule of a people, which brought about colonial imperialism. Background: the Portuguese were the first post-Middle Ages Europeans to firmly establish settlements, trade posts, permanent fortifications and ports of call along the coast of the African continent, from the beginning of the Age of Discovery. During the 15th century, there was little interest in, and less knowledge of, the interior for some 2 centuries thereafter. European exploration of the African interior began in earnest at the end of the 18th century. By 1835, Europeans had mapped most of northwestern Africa. In the middle decades of the 19th century, the most famous of the European explorers were David Livingstone and H. M. Stanley, both of whom mapped vast areas of southern Africa and Central Africa. Arduous expeditions in the 1850s and 1860s by Richard Burton, John Speke and James Grant located the Great Central Lakes and the source of the Nile. By the end of the 19th century, Europeans had charted the Nile from its source, traced the courses of the Niger, Congo and Zambezi rivers, and realized the vast resources of Africa. Even as late as the 1870s, European states still controlled only 10% of the African continent, all the territories being near the coast. The most important holdings were Angola and Mozambique, held by Portugal, the Cape Colony, held by the United Kingdom, and Algeria, held by France. By 1914, only Ethiopia and Liberia were independent of European control. Technological advancement facilitated overseas expansionism. Industrialization brought about rapid advancements in transportation and communication, especially in the forms of steam navigation, railways, and telegraphs. Medical advances also were important, especially medicines for tropical diseases. The development of quinine, an effective treatment for malaria, enabled vast expanses of the tropics to be accessed by Europeans. Causes: Africa and global markets. Sub-Saharan Africa, one of the last regions of the world largely untouched by informal imperialism, was also attractive to Europe's ruling elites for economic, political and social reasons. During a time when Britain's balance of trade showed a growing deficit, with shrinking and increasingly protectionist continental markets due to the Long Depression, Africa offered Britain, Germany, France, and other countries an open market that would garner them a trade surplus, a market that bought more from the colonial power than it sold overall. In addition, surplus capital was often more profitably invested overseas, where cheap materials, limited competition, and abundant raw materials made a greater premium possible. Another inducement for imperialism arose from the demand for raw materials unavailable in Europe, especially copper, cotton, rubber, palm oil, cocoa, diamonds, tea, and tin, to which European consumers had grown accustomed and upon which European industry had grown dependent. Additionally, Britain wanted the southern and eastern coasts of Africa for stopover ports on the route to Asia and its empire in India. However, in Africa, excluding the area which became the Union of South Africa in 1910, the amount of capital investment by Europeans was relatively small compared to other continents. Consequently, the companies involved in tropical African commerce were relatively small, apart from Cecil Rhodes as De Beers Mining Company. Rhodes had carved out Rhodesia for himself. Leopold II of Belgium later, and with considerable brutality, exploited the Congo Free State. These events might detract from the pro-imperialist arguments of colonial lobbyists such as the All-Deutsche Verband, Francesco Crispi and Jules Ferry, who argued that sheltered overseas markets in Africa would solve the problems of low prices and overproduction caused by shrinking continental markets. John A. Hobson argued in Imperialism that this shrinking of continental markets was a key factor of the global new imperialism period. William Easterly of New York University, however, disagrees with the link made between capitalism and imperialism, arguing that colonialism is used mostly to promote state-led development rather than corporate development. He has stated that imperialism is not so clearly linked to capitalism and free markets. Historically, there has been a closer link between colonialism, imperialism and state-led approaches to development. Strategic rivalry. The rivalry between Britain, France, Germany, and the other European powers accounts for a large part of the colonization. While tropical Africa was not a large zone of investment, other overseas regions were. The vast interior between the gold and diamond-rich southern Africa and Egypt had strategic value in securing the flow of overseas trade. Britain was under political pressure to secure lucrative markets against encroaching rivals in China and its eastern colonies, most notably India, Malaya, Australia, and New Zealand. Thus, securing the key waterway between East and West, the Suez Canal, was crucial. However, the prominent theory proposed by William L. Langer in Imperial Diplomacy, and Ronald Robinson and John Andrew Gallagher in Africa and the Victorians, which suggested that Britain annexed East Africa in the 1880–90s out of geostrategic concerns connected to the Nile Valley and Britain's position in Egypt, and by extension the sea route to India via the Suez Canal, was challenged by John Darwin in 1997, a refutation that was further contextualized and consolidated by Jonas F. Yarso in 2015. The scramble for African territory also reflected a concern for the acquisition of military and naval bases for strategic purposes and the exercise of power. The growing navies, and new ships driven by steam power, required coaling stations and ports for maintenance. Defense bases were also needed for the protection of sea routes and communication lines, particularly of expensive and vital international waterways such as the Suez Canal. Colonies were also seen as assets in balance of power negotiations, useful as items of exchange at times of international bargaining. Colonies with large native populations were also a source of military power. Britain and France used large numbers of British Indian and North African soldiers, respectively, in many of the colonial wars. In the age of nationalism, there was pressure for a nation to acquire an empire as a status symbol. The idea of greatness became linked with the sense of duty underlying many nations' strategies. In the early 1880s, Pierre Savorgnan de Brazza was exploring the Kingdom of Congo for France. At the same time, Henry Morton Stanley explored it on behalf of Leopold II of Belgium, who would have it as his personal Congo Free State. France occupied Tunisia in May 1881, which may have convinced Italy to join the German-Austrian dual alliance in 1882, thus forming the Triple Alliance. The same year, Britain occupied Egypt, which ruled over Sudan and parts of Chad, Eritrea, and Somalia. In 1884, Germany declared Togoland, the Cameroons and Southwest Africa to be under its protection, and France occupied Guinea. French West Africa was founded in 1895, and French Equatorial Africa in 1910. Germany's Weltpolitik. Germany was hardly a colonial power before the new imperialism period, but would eagerly participate in this race. Fragmented in various states, Germany was only unified under Prussia's rule after the 1866 Battle of Königgrätz and the 1870 Franco-Prussian War. A rising industrial power close on the heels of Britain, Germany began its world expansion in the 1880s. After isolating France by the dual alliance with Austria-Hungary and then the 1882 Triple Alliance with Italy, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck proposed the 1884–85 Berlin Conference, which set the rules of effective control of a foreign territory. Weltpolitik was the foreign policy adopted by Kaiser Wilhelm II in 1890, with the aim of transforming Germany into a global power through aggressive diplomacy, the acquisition of overseas colonies, and the development of a large navy. Some Germans, claiming themselves of Friedrich List's thought, advocated expansion in the Philippines and Timor. Others proposed to set themselves in Formosa, etc. At the end of the 1870s, these isolated voices began to be relayed by a real imperialist policy, backed by mercantilist thesis. In 1881, Habschleiden, the lawyer, published Deutsche Colonization, according to which the development of national consciousness demanded an independent overseas policy. Pan-Germanism was thus linked to the young nation's imperialist drives. In the beginning of the 1880s, the Deutsche Kolonialverein was created, and got its own magazine in 1884, the Colonial Zeitung. This colonial hobby was also relayed by the nationalist All-Deutsche Verband. Generally, Bismarck was opposed to widespread German colonialism, but he had to resign at the insistence of the new German Emperor Wilhelm II on the 18th of March 1890. Wilhelm II instead adopted a very aggressive policy of colonization and colonial expansion. Germany's expansionism would lead to the Tirpitz Plan, implemented by Admiral von Tirpitz, who would also champion the various fleet acts starting in 1898, thus engaging in an arms race with Britain. By 1914, they had given Germany the second largest naval force in the world. According to von Tirpitz, this aggressive naval policy was supported by the National Liberal Party rather than by the Conservatives, implying that imperialism was supported by the rising middle classes. Germany became the third largest colonial power in Africa. Nearly all of its overall empire of 2.6 million square kilometers and 14 million colonial subjects in 1914 was found in its African possessions of Southwest Africa, Togoland, the Cameroons, and Tanganyika. Following the 1904 Entente Cordiale between France and the British Empire, Germany tried to isolate France in 1905 with the First Moroccan Crisis. This led to the 1905 Algeciras Conference, in which France's influence on Morocco was compensated by the exchange of other territories, and then to the Agadir Crisis in 1911. Along with the 1898 Fashoda incident between France and Britain. This succession of international crises reveals the bitterness of the struggle between the various imperialist nations, which ultimately led to World War I. Italy's expansion. Italy took possession of parts of Eritrea in 1870 and 1882. Following its defeat in the First Italo-Ethiopian War, it acquired Italian Somaliland in 1889–90 and the whole of Eritrea. In 1911, it engaged in a war with the Ottoman Empire, in which it acquired Tripolitania and Cyrenaica. In 1919, Enrico Corradini, who fully supported the war, and later merged his group in the early fascist party, developed the concept of proletarian nationalism, supposed to legitimize Italy's imperialism by a mixture of socialism with nationalism. We must start by recognizing the fact that there are proletarian nations as well as proletarian classes, that is to say, there are nations whose living conditions are subject to the way of life of other nations, just as classes are. Once this is realized, nationalism must insist firmly on this truth: Italy is, materially and morally, a proletarian nation. The Second Italo-Abyssinian War, ordered by the fascist Benito Mussolini, would actually be one of the last colonial wars, occupying Ethiopia, which had remained the last independent African territory, apart from Liberia.